All right. Hello, everyone. Today we have the privilege of talking with a true expert in the field of sports science, Mr. Richard Bucciarelli. Hey, Richard, how's it going?
Hey, Ellie, not bad, not bad. How are you? You're making me blush.
I know. I know. Thanks for joining us. I know we've spoken before, so for those who have watched other episodes, I'm sure you've seen Richard come across the screen. But if you don't know him, Richard is a researcher. He's a university lecturer and the owner of Speed Training and Soccer Fitness in Toronto, Canada. So Richard has been at the forefront of developing and implementing strategies for optimizing athlete performance at all levels and ages. Did I miss anything in there, Richard?
Yeah, I think that's fine.
That's good. Okay. Well, today's conversation, we are really seeking to understand why periodization and load management are not just buzzwords, but cornerstones of effective coaching. So, without further ado, I'm going to start very simply by asking, what is periodization and why has it become such a popular approach in coaching?
Right. So periodization is a concept that was originally developed. I would say it's probably about 40, almost 50 years ago now. We have to give maybe some credit to the former Soviet Union and some of the excellent sports scientists and sports training programs they had there. Ideology notwithstanding, they did a good job at developing athletes, and they were really the first ones to kind of come up with this concept. And actually, the name periodization essentially what it means is taking any longer period of time, maybe a year, maybe several months or whatever it is, and then dividing it up into smaller periods of time. And so essentially periodization means looking at a yearly training plan or any type of long-term training plan, and then dividing it into small periods of time. And the focus of the training in each period of time will be different. If we're talking again about load, and I'm sure we'll get into it a bit more, but like the actual parameters in terms of volume of training, intensity of training, type of training, all those kinds of things will be different in one period to the next. And everything is geared around optimizing the results of training, which are essentially to get the highest possible levels of physical conditioning and physical performance, and at the same time, the lowest possible risk of any type of sickness or injury.
Okay, nice. So you did say a couple words in there that I want to clarify.
Sure.
The concept of training load, because we hear it paired a lot with periodization. So where does training load fit into the context of periodization?
Right. Yeah. So great question, and I would say that like I mentioned, that the different parameters of training will be adjusted or changed in each period of time within a periodized plan. One of the things that will certainly change and be adjusted is training load, and so often you might even hear the term periodization of training load. So training load, to understand that concept, basically we have to look at kind of the two key variables that determine training load, which are volume and intensity. So volume, in the simplest way, you can think of training volume simply as time, the amount of minutes, the amount of days, etc., that an athlete trains. And intensity essentially is the physical or physiological response that an athlete has to training. And so, again, if we want to think of load in a more simple way, volume can be time and intensity can be measured. I think we spoke offline about this before, but intensity can be measured without any technology at all, very simply by using a scale called the rating of perceived exertion, which is literally the athlete's rating of their perception of how much exertion or basically how hard they exerted themselves during training. Sometimes it's a scale from 0 to 10, with 0 being rest and 10 being maximal. Sometimes it can be 6 to 20 or 0 to 100, or in any of those measures. But any one of them is a way to quantify the intensity, and then the volume will be quantified by time in minutes. And as a matter of fact, if you take those two numbers, which is the rating of perceived exertion, let's just say it was 0 to 10, and an athlete may have had a very hard training session physically, and they'll call that session a 9 out of 10.
Mm.
And then you take the number of minutes, and let's just say hypothetically that, that number of minutes was 100 minutes. Well, you take 9, which is the intensity, you multiply it by 100, which is the volume in minutes, and you get 900, and that might be the training load for that day. So load is the product of volume and intensity. And I gave you a simple way to think about it, but then if there's access to technology, then there are more I won't just say more complicated, but more accurate and precise ways to think about it and to measure it.
So there are ways to do it without technology and the formula you shared. But you also mentioned that technology can offer a more comprehensive view of load.
Right.
In your experience, how have you typically measured or managed workload or training load for your athletes? What are like the common tools or methods that you use or that you've seen used in the industry?
Right. So I mentioned kind of that simple way, which is rating of perceived exertion multiplied by time in minutes. And that is an excellent way. And in some of the environments, even in some of the higher level environments that I work, there isn't always a budget for technology. And so that's a good method. And as long as athletes are honest when they're reporting their rating of perceived exertion, you can get pretty reliable data that way. I've also used many different types of technology. So if we go back to the concept, right, which is measuring volume and measuring intensity, well, how do we make those measurements more precise? And technology is a way to do that. So on the volume side of the equation, rather than just the number of minutes, there are GPS and also accelerometer type products. And these products are able to quantify not just time, but they're able to quantify movement. So for example, you can figure out how much distance a player covered in a particular training session or game. You can count the number of sprints or the number of fast runs or the distance that was covered at different intensities. And then with the higher resolution products, GPS and accelerometers, you can also measure the accelerations and even the deceleration. So an acceleration is where velocity increases, and a deceleration is where velocity decreases. So all of those together are a way to quantify volume. And you can even think of it a little bit as volume, and volume can almost be synonymous with mechanical load, how much movement was done, right? Mm-hmm. And then on the other side, we have intensity. And I mentioned that that's, it's a physiological measure. And so as of now, until something new comes along, you never know with AI or whatever, but right now, the best and by far the most accurate and most precise measure of physiological load that we have that can be used in soccer and other, contact sports is heart rate. Okay, so if we can use a heart rate monitor, we can measure, essentially heart rate is measuring the number of times that the heart beats per minute. And then, that can then be applied to look at, let's say, for example, what's considered maximum intensity or any other types of zones of intensity. So it's a direct physiological measure of the intensity of the workout that the player actually experienced. That's the more precise and accurate form of measuring intensity. And then on the other side, you get the volume or mechanical load, which is how much the player did. And most of the different products, whether it's a GPS or an accelerometer product that combines with heart rate, they'll have a load metric, training load, player load, that kind of thing. And that metric, there's some kind of algorithm which factors in both the mechanical load and the physiological load. Sometimes, they're directly multiplied. Sometimes there's some other, formula, but basically those two variables are factored in, and that's how you get load.
Okay, nice. Well, the secrets now. The secrets behind all of the things.
Secret sauce. Yeah.
No, that's amazing. I think there's another couple of phrases that I want to break down that I think, again, are these buzzwords that float around in this field, and that's like chronic and acute training. So can you explain that a little bit and break that down a little bit further? Right.
So I think it's important when we think about load that, of course, every single time that any athlete has a workout, soccer practice, game, whatever it is, there's a load. There's a mechanical load and physiological load. But that load, it's important not to think of it in isolation, because it doesn't occur in isolation. It's the next day after a training session, and it's the accumulation of or the culmination rather of whatever load was experienced throughout the week, etc. So this is the way athletes work, and periodization is really about balancing load from day to day, from week to week, from periods of time. So there was this concept which kind of came about again a few decades ago, and it's been kind of advanced upon in the literature in more recent years. But the concept is sort of the relationship between the acute load, which is the load that an athlete does today or on the time that it's measured, and the relationship between that and the chronic workload, which is some sort of long-term and kind of an average of a longer period of time before the particular day. And there's again different formulas, different concepts, but basically chronic load, you can think of it almost as representative of the athlete's current fitness level. Because for you as an athlete, what you've been doing, or the average, and sometimes it can be a moving average and a weighted average, but what you've been doing over 3 weeks or a month, the average of that is pretty close to what your physical fitness level is right now. Now, the relationship between that, which is your fitness, and then what you do today, that's going to kind of determine whether what you did today was too easy, too hard, or just right, or just kind of in that sweet spot. And there's actually a kind of a metric that can be calculated, which is called the acute to chronic workload ratio, which is simply a ratio between the acute load, what you did today, and the chronic load, what you've been doing over the last 3 weeks. And the literature, it's really interesting about this, is that if the ratio is no lower than 0.8, and that means what you did today is no lower than 20% lower than what your physical fitness or physical capacity is, and no higher than about 1.2 or 1.3, so no greater than 20 to 30% higher than what your physical capacity is, that's kind of considered the sweet spot, which means that the load is high enough that you can improve. You can challenge the heart and lungs to adapt. You can challenge the muscles to adapt and get stronger. You can achieve that with a minimal risk of injury. There's never no risk of injury, but that's how you kind of minimize the risk of injury. So that ratio is very important. And again, if you have a good way of measuring load, then you just have to do the math, and then you can figure out whether the load that you're doing, whether it's you as an athlete or coach planning for the team or whatever, you can kind of figure out whether it fits within that range.
Really interesting. It's nice to have these formulas that at first glance are like, whoa, that's too much. But when you break it down and you contextualize it, it makes clear. It's clear. It makes clear sense.
Yeah, and I'll build on that just a little bit with the idea that, like, going back to periodization, right? So actually, what periodization allows athletes and coaches to do, if they have a good, accurate, and precise way of measuring load, is it allows them to make small incremental increases in load. And that's usually, it's not going to be every single day. That's not the way it works, but that's why you have a period of time. That period of time might be 7 days or 10 days. And from one 7-day or 1 week period to the next, maybe there's a small increase in load within that same ratio. So 5%, 10%, not more than 20. Okay. And if that's done properly, then what ends up happening is, again, the athlete will improve. And all of this, so that's, what periodization is about. And all of this kind of goes back to a really key and fundamental principle, which you can call it a principle of periodization, or you can simply call it a principle of training, which is the principle of overload. And so what does that mean? Well, overload means a load that you experience which is a little bit greater than your current physical capacity. So the muscles, in addition to the heart muscle and the skeletal muscles, the lungs, all of our physiological systems will only ever respond in a positive way. They'll only ever get stronger or more efficient at delivering energy, or whatever the adaptation is. They will only ever respond and adapt if there is an overload presented to them. In other words, they will only respond if the acute to chronic workload ratio is greater than 1.
Right.
So this is a way to kind of quantify it.
Right. Can you tie this into maybe some of the misconceptions about overtraining? I think the way you're talking about this and the gradual increases and the gradual growth over time, it makes sense. But I think, again, a big shadow that kind of comes up in the training world is this idea of like overtraining, overtraining, overtraining. How does that fit into what you're talking about?
Right, great question. And so let's think about that ratio, right? So that the acute to chronic workload ratio, again, the ratio in terms of what you've done today versus what you're capable of, because that's the chronic load, what you've been doing over 3-4 weeks. So if that ratio is too high, higher than 1.3, then the implication is that you've done something today which is 30% or more higher than what you're capable of. And so rather than kind of linking, because usually overtraining, the concept of overtraining is kind of blamed for the increased rate of injuries that athletes experience. And these can be anything from soft tissue injuries, injuries to bones, muscles, tendons, you name it. Okay. A lot of times, let's say, and again, to me, it is a misconception, and it's almost, it is a bit of a myth in terms of saying that the reason that athletes, especially young athletes, are getting hurt more now than maybe they were in previous decades is because they're overtraining. In other words, they're training too much. What's actually happening, and what actually is the true cause of injuries, is when that ratio is too high. So it's not too much, it's too much too soon. If training was more properly periodized, and each small period of time, again, 7 days, 10 days, whatever, if training load was increased in small increments, 5 to 10% during each period, then there's no reason to think that even a young athlete could not build up their capacity, build up their chronic workload to the point at which they should be able to handle a much higher workload and, again, minimize their risk of injury. So this is kind of it's a misconception. And the misconception is blaming the rise in injuries on overtraining. Mm. And what happens then, unfortunately, is that, well, I mean, imagine if I told you, well, Ellie, I mean, you got hurt, and the reason you got hurt is you're training too much. What's the first thing you're going to do?
Stop training.
Yeah, you're going to stop training, or you're going to train less.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden now your fitness level, which is your chronic workload, your capacity, what happens to it now? It goes down. Mm. And now, okay, the subsequent risk of injury or re-injury for you actually goes up. Yeah. Because now you can't even maybe handle, it sounds simple, but if you take a player who's training, let's say 4 days a week, and you tell them they're training too much, well, now they're only going to train 2 days a week. Mm. Now all of a sudden their physical and physiological capacity decreases. Now, whatever risk there was of that player playing in a game or whatever, all of a sudden, that risk is now, in terms of injury, is now going up because their fitness level is going down.
Wow.
And so I would turn the whole thing on its head, and I would say we need to teach coaches, and we need to teach parents and athletes, especially those that are working with young athletes and the young athletes themselves, about periodization. We need to teach them how to monitor their training load, how to measure it and track it. And then we need to teach them about the principle of overload and how, again, safely and using that acute to chronic workload ratio, how they can make gradual incremental increases in load. And if they do that, then they can build up their capacity to the point where they can handle any, almost any load that's thrown at them. Again, almost always, right, if we're thinking too much too soon, the rise in injuries occurs at the start of a competitive season, or at some point where a player jumps up to a higher competitive level, where the volume and or the intensity that they're now experiencing, in other words, the load that they're now experiencing, is just too high. It's more than 30% greater than what they were capable of. And if we start to zero in on that and keeping that ratio within, again, 0.8 to 1.2, I believe we won't see the rise in injuries the way we have.
Yeah. Do you see, I don't know if it's in the literature or in the data, like what those specific moments look like, or if there is a correlation between like increase in injury and these like transition periods for certain athletes. Like, is there correlating data that shows the relation between the two?
100%. So it's very clear, and this has been well documented for probably about 2 decades now, is that the type of soft tissue injuries, even injuries to ligaments and things like that, that are more or less considered preventable, because there are some contact injuries that are difficult to prevent in soccer and other sports, but those that are more preventable, or where you can mitigate risk more, that injuries are almost always preceded by an accumulation of fatigue. So whenever fatigue is measured, and there's lots of ways to measure that, with rising morning heart rate, or changes in heart rate variability, decreases in muscle strength and power, problem sleeping, although they're preceded by that, and they're also preceded by some rise in training load disproportionate to the current fitness level of the athlete. So there's lots of clear data on that. That's actually how the concept of acute to chronic workload ratio was developed. It was developed as a way to, again, because if you think about, you can teach coaches or players about periodization, and you can tell them you need to start, you need overload, and you need to start, gradually increasing the load. But the first thing that probably a coach that has any sense would ask is, well, by how much? How much is acceptable? And sometimes like if you're in a gym and you're lifting weights, it's fairly easy to think about, because let's just say the most weight that you could bench press right now for any number of repetitions is 100 pounds. Of course, if that's what you're capable of, I wouldn't just tomorrow put 150 pounds on the bar and tell you to do it. You wouldn't be able to do it. That's easy to comprehend. But when we're talking about soccer and designing exercises that have small-sided games and drills and things like that, where there's so many variables into play, well now it's not that simple as just adding weight or decreasing weight. Now all of a sudden we need to say, okay, well, maybe we're going to make the field bigger. Maybe we're going to play this small-sided game for an extra 30 seconds or minute, or maybe we're going to decrease the rest, whatever it is. And we think we're going to get a particular load out of it, but we need to check it, right? We need to check it with a heart rate monitor. We need to check how the players responded to it, and so these are real crucial concepts if we want to to achieve the result, again, of optimizing physical performance and minimizing risk of injury.
Right. I hear you. And that again comes back to why, yes, you can do non-technological approaches, but the technology does give you a clearer, more comprehensive idea of what is going on.
Yeah.
So my next question really relates to, and I think you've touched on it a few times here, is how is training load different for professional athletes compared to youth players? And what drives these differences?
Good question. And maybe I'll make a long story a little bit short. So the first thing that's quite interesting, again, if we use this concept of, it's probably not true that young athletes are doing too much. Okay, so I'll go, before I talk about professional versus youth or whatever, I'll even talk about pre-puberty or pre-growth spurt and post. Because often in soccer, again, we're told from the powers that be and the people in the provincial and national associations that young kids, especially before puberty or whatever, that there's limits placed on the number of hours and the number of days and whatever that they can train. And typically what happens as kids progress in soccer and in other sports is the volume, the number of hours, the number of days goes up as their age increases. However, young children before puberty actually have a far greater tolerance to training volume than older athletes do, because they're lighter, they're smaller, and their tendons and ligaments are much more pliable. So it's not uncommon if you go to if you have a brother, sister, or child, that's in kindergarten or, early elementary school or whatever, before puberty, to see them running around all day. At school, at home, they have a very high tolerance to do different types of exercise and sports or whatever. They self-regulate. So when they get tired, they slow down and, they pace themselves and all that when they have to. But in terms of the number of hours, there's no way that a teenage athlete after puberty could train at the same volume or exercise at the same volume that a younger athlete can. So I think the first thing that probably should be done is we should, again, turn things upside down a little bit and recommend and advise and promote young athletes and coaches of young athletes and parents of young children to try to get as much volume of physical activity as they can throughout the day. That includes in the morning, during school, gym class, recess, after school, programs, all of it, as much as possible. This builds a very high physical capacity. It leads into, kind of the theories of long-term athlete development and late specialization and all of that. So that's all good. As young athletes get older, instead of, because this is very common, right? And I know you were a soccer player too, so I'm sure you experienced this. As you get from your club team to maybe a state, or in our Canada provincial program, or the higher level, right? What happens to training load, volume, and intensity? It shoots way up. Yeah. So you go from training 3 days a week to 4 or 5 or every day, right? Now you go from your club or even provincial program or state program. Now you get to college or university. What happens to training load? Again, way up. First of all, probably those ratios are off. And second of all, actually, as players get older, yes, they can handle a higher intensity, but volume, we need to be careful with volume. And if you think of the formula, actually, by making small or even moderate changes in volume, we can have a very large effect on training load, even without the technology. Remember, volume without technology is measured in minutes. So if you cut the minutes down by 30%, your training load goes way down. You have a much greater, kind of capacity to manipulate that volume variable. So you asked me about professional versus youth. It's very, very common to see in a professional club that the fittest players, the ones that train the hardest, the ones that experience the highest load, all of it, by whatever metric you want to look at, are the ones that are kind of in the 9th, 10th, and 11th grade. Okay. And I've even published some stuff where I, back when I worked at the TFC Academy, and I actually had an interesting little study where we compared the Toronto FC Academy, MLS club, professional academy, to a professional academy in Uruguay for the club that I worked with in South America. Okay. And in both cases, it was those young adolescents, let's call them, right, in the last couple of years of high school. Those were the ones that actually were experiencing a higher training load than the older full professionals. Because again, I'm talking about men, it's a little different with women. You can kind of press rewind on the ages a bit, but the same trend occurs, which is that as athletes get a little bit older, and certainly as they become professional, they have to be a lot more careful about the training load that they use in training. And of course, then that's where this whole concept of load management comes in. There's no way that a 30 or 35-year-old soccer player is going to train as much or as hard as an 18 or 19-year-old player. So I think, it starts from the very, very young ages in sports. But I think, just like with the overtraining myth, we need to kind of rethink what's really causing, this rise in injuries and all that. We also need to look at the kind of the guidelines that are given to coaches and athletes and parents about training volume and training load and all of that, and say, well, maybe we need to turn it upside down, and we need to say, when you're young, before puberty, you have to get as much exercise as you can. In the years during and immediately after the growth spurt, there's some specific concerns around hormone levels and changes in height and weight and strength and differences with males and females, all of that, right? Like, so there's a lot more complicated than just training less, but you have to be more, conscious of all of those, components. And then as athletes progress through adolescence and into adulthood, and certainly into the professional level, the training intensity should still be very high, but the training volume has to start decreasing, and we have to start factoring in, again, how are they responding? Yeah. And I'll tell you, the number one metric for sure in the pro game is always, are they staying healthy? So if nothing else, like, my work, every professional club I've ever worked with, and all the, my colleagues and the people I've talked to in the higher levels, essentially we are evaluated as fitness coaches and sports scientists, not so much on whether or not the players that we work with are fast and strong, because, especially if you get them when they're an adult, there's not much you can do to improve their fitness anyway. It's, did you keep them healthy? And were
Interesting.
they able to play whatever number of games, whatever the coach required of them? Were they able to do that and stay healthy? So
Brilliant. Love that. I love that. I think for our final question today, I wanted to ask if you do foresee any trends or like new technologies or maybe the presence of AI that might influence periodization and load management.
Right. So I guess I can talk about a few things I've seen and a few things that I think might happen. But uh, all of it, I think, comes down to, we're talking about finding ways to accurately and to more accurately and more precisely measure what's going on. Okay, because it all starts from that. Again, I talked about the no technology version versus heart rate, GPS, accelerometers, and the greater accuracy and greater precision that you get with technology, and how that then allows for more detailed and more informed decisions by coaches. So the our ability as coaches and sports scientists and everything to monitor and to track load, volume, and intensity, and all the different kind of details that go into that. It's getting better and better. Whether it's beyond pulse, polar, or catapult, there's R&D teams with computer engineers and even kind of data scientists and people that are working together to try to increase the precision and the accuracy of the monitoring tools. So that's already happening. Just one simple example that I've seen a really cool soccer facility in France, which has very, very, very high resolution cameras that are actually able, and they're positioned all over the field, and these cameras are actually able to calculate with each movement that the player does the displacement, the velocity, the acceleration, the force, and the power that's produced with each movement. It's almost like the entire field is a giant force plate, but it's not an actual force plate. It's just being measured by cameras, and there's even cameras that are being developed which are so sensitive that they can detect heart rate to the point that you never know. At some point, even chest straps may not be necessary if this technology becomes cheaper and more available. So why is this all being done? Again, to get a better and a more clear picture of what's going on. So that's already happening, and I think it'll continue to happen. Another, I would say, interesting trend that I've seen, and I have some friends and colleagues that are doing it, is contextualizing what's happening in the game. Okay, because it's very, very easy for me or anyone else to stand up on a tower and tell people how much they're running and how many tackles or whatever they've done. But remember that soccer is not running. Soccer is not track and field. Soccer is about the interaction that each player has with his or her teammates and the opponents and the ball. And of course, all the other variables like the score in the game and the weather and the importance of the game and all of those things. And so there is this really awesome and interesting emerging field of research called social networking analysis, which and you have to forgive me because I don't understand the math exactly, but basically you can build mathematical models that can kind of quantify all of those interactions.
Cool.
Me to you as two center backs, and us to our fullbacks, and to the goalkeeper, and the relationship in time and space and everything that we have, but also in relation to the other team, also in relation to the ball, and also with many other different variables being fed into sophisticated computer systems that can quantify these relationships, and they build these really awesome looking three-dimensional waves that can actually quantify things like momentum.
Interesting.
Like how particular passing interactions influence the ability of one team to advance into the final third and create scoring chances and all of that, and the physical data. Okay, so the running, the sprinting, the changes of direction, the accelerations can also get factored into that. How many accelerations have to happen and when and between which parts of the field in order to optimize team performance and momentum and all those things. And so those are, and again, AI is being used directly in both of those examples I gave. It's being used to increase accuracy and precision of measurement of the physical variables. It's also being used to increase the overall ability to contextualize the movements and the running and everything that's happening in games, and make it probably more relevant and applicable and valid to soccer. So yeah, again, I bit of a long answer there, but I think that's kind of the future of sports science and technology in the game as I see it. So
Fantastic. This was awesome, Richard. I think to close really quick, I do want to introduce anyone who's listening to one of our newest offerings at Beyond Pulse, which is our Data Analyst on Demand service. So Data Analyst on Demand takes your data and makes it easy to use. So when you team up with your dedicated data analyst, you'll dive deep into your team's unique needs and goals. You'll receive weekly reports, personalized training plans, and direct feedback, so you can develop data-backed coaching strategies that can make a real impact, that can keep your players healthy, like we've talked about today. With Data Analyst on Demand, you can prevent injuries and burnout and really fine-tune your training sessions. So for more information, I'll leave a link in the description below, or you can simply visit info.beyondpulse.com/data analyst on demand and get your data your way. So that is all we have for today. Again, I'd like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to Richard, as always, for jumping on and sharing his expertise and insights. It's always an enlightening conversation with Richard, so this will undoubtedly benefit coaches, players, trainers alike. So thank you, Richard. We appreciate it.
you're welcome, and thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to speak to you, and hopefully, some valuable information came out of this that can help, players, coaches, and the athletes themselves.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you all for tuning in. We will see you next time. See you later.